this talk, I shall try and survey for you some of the important developments in Indian English poetry, trying to bring the story up to our times. But as in any survey, you need to really understand the origins and the context in which a particular form of writing develops. So you really need to go back again to the middle of the 19th century. And there you'll find that 2 or 3 important poets who tried their hand at poetry in the English language are available for us. And that, of course, links up with this whole debate about English education in India and ideas of Indian identity, nationhood, and a whole range of such related concerns. Toru Dutt is one of my important poets. Toru Dutt was an extraordinary person. She didn't live very long. Like Keats, she died very early. Toru Dutt was a very learned person. Not only did she delve into French literature and the French language, but she had also read a whole range of English and European writers. Later in life, perhaps as a result of her interaction with Europeans and with the English people, and maybe a sense of race coming in the way of proper contact with them, she began looking at the Indian literary texts and imbibing the best of the Puranic literature. So her poetry has a good deal of all these ingredients. But right now I want to talk about one poem of hers called The Lotus. In the lotus, which as you all recognize is a great flower which we associate with so many things in India. It's usually grown in reasonably dirty water, all right? But the water does not upset it. Even if you pour some water on the lotus, the water falls off. It is a beautiful flower when it blooms. It is used for worship. When we talk about someone dead, we say so and so attained the lotus feet of the Lord. When we think of our gods and goddesses, we see some of them standing on a lotus, right? So the lotus has had a tremendous symbolic significance for the Indian mind. And Toru Dutt, choosing this particular flower and to write a poem about it, very clearly is trying to tell us something about India. Look at the poem. I don't have the text for me to read now, but I'll paraphrase it for you. We have a debate in the flower garden between the rose and the lily. The rose says, I am more beautiful than the lily because I am red and pink and full of life. And the lily says, I am the fairest. I am tall and beautiful and fair. And so this faction war between the flowers goes on. And then they go to the gods, and then the gods finally decide that we won't have either the rose or the lily, but we'll have a lotus. Now the lotus has both the pinkness of the rose and the whiteness of the lily. So it's a beautiful flower which combines 2 qualities which one associates with Europe. Whiteness, fairness, rosiness, these are all European attributes. If you think in terms of black and white and race and color and so on. So here is Toru Dutt writing a poem, focusing attention on the lotus and telling us something about the importance of India. That's one beautiful poem and written at the early part of her career. I think it's an extraordinary effort at telling the Europeans, look, I may have to use your language. I may have to use the form which you have given me, like the sonnet, but I will be able to pour into European forms and English genres and Indian content. Because the lotus, as I pointed out, stands for so many qualities. It is above all symbolic of detachment. When we say perform detached action, as the Bhagavad Gita often enjoins us, the idea is that we cannot live away from the world. We have to live in the world. We are in the world, but we should not be off the world. Just as the lotus is in the water, in the brackish, dirty water, and grows best only in that kind of water, it should not become part of the water. When the water falls on it, it just falls off the lotus. It's a wonderful image for detached living. So here is Toru Dutt writing a beautiful poem in the English language and in a very, very subtle way asserting an Indian value. Because I think we'll all admit that the lotus stands for some national character. It's certainly a beautiful flower, and it's obviously something which combines the beauty of the rose and the odor of the rose and the beauty of the lily. That's one of the poems I thought you might like to read one of these days, just to see how Indian English poetry develops over a period of time. And it was written in the 1870s or so. Okay? The other person is Desrosiers. I mentioned Desrosiers as a teacher of Hindu College. Hindu College, which was founded in 1817, remember that? Yes. In 1817, is a college which was meant to impart English education. Why? Because education before that was very often in Persian or in Sanskrit or in some of the local languages, and it was felt by Europeans and by many Indians themselves, like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, that we should have a modern education. Now, a modern education cannot be given in Sanskrit or in Persian. A modern education can be given in English. And therefore, Hindu College taught Sanskrit and Persian, but taught it with the help of English, as with the medium of English, apart from introducing people to English history, English politics, English literature, and English culture. So this was an effort. And the students who came to Hindu College were all people from upper class Brahmin families, Hindu families. When they came to Hindu College and they found a teacher called Desrosiers there, Desrosiers was a terror because he was a revolutionary thinker. He had imbibed the principles of the French Revolution of equality, liberty, and fraternity and whatnot. And he was trying to tell these students, you must fight against your parents, you must give up these ancient Hindu ways, forget about all this idea of pollution, purity, of caste and so on, eat beef, drink wine. This is what he was doing. Not only did he teach them, but he also took them away from classes, had parties in the evening, and they ate beef and they began drinking wine. So these Kulin, Brahmin families of Calcutta, got terribly upset and they withdrew their children from Hindu College. And things came to such a pass that Desrosiers was finally dismissed from Hindu College. He was a great intellectual, but then that was it. After a year or so of this dismissal, he had nothing to do. He drank and killed himself. Okay? But Desrosiers' poem is about the harp of India. It's about the students, to the students of Hindu College, where he's constantly saying that we have had a wonderful music in India in the past. Where is that music gone? Why is it that we are not able to revive that music again? We should. The new harp of India is now coming here. Desrosiers is the new harp. We shall now talk about the beauty of this country and then create conditions for the future of this land to become modern and progressive and so on. He's a revolutionary writer, but he wrote these things in English. Okay? So you can see that Indian English poetry has a very honorable history of nearly 150 years. And Toru Dutt, the first woman poet of India, also in a way generates a great tradition of Indian women poets in English. And one thinks of Kamala Das, one thinks of Eunice D'Souza, one thinks of Menka Shivadasani, and a whole range of Indian women poets who have been operating in the last 20-25 years. Okay? So revolutionary, that's what I was wanting you to understand. Now, there are other writers like Madhusudan Dutt, for example. Madhusudan Dutt became a great writer in Bengali, Meghnath Bad. He wrote a wonderful epic in Bengali after the initial efforts at writing in English. It's a good example of someone in poetry doing what Bankim did, trying to write in English, getting fed up with it, feeling that this is not my forte, and then moving on into English. other writers also of that time. And we all know that India is very often looked upon as a spiritual country. Can you say a word or two about Indian spirituality in the 19th century? Can you mention one or two major thinkers who spoke about Indian religion, tradition, and spirituality?
Aurobindo and Vivekananda.
Aurobindo is one, Swami Vivekananda is the other. Any other names you can think of? Mahatma Gandhi?
Yes, Mahatma.
Right?
Yeah.
Mahatma Gandhi, I think that's a very good thing. And you have other thinkers like Bankim himself, who wrote about Hinduism and Hindu culture. So this is a tendency. One of the reasons why people talked about this was they wanted to distance themselves or distinguish themselves from the English. The English were obviously very powerful. They had conquered us, and they had a very modern way of looking at things. They introduced English education into India, scientific thinking. You remember 1857, in spite of the fact that Delhi was overwhelmingly with the rebels could not organize themselves well enough to defeat the English, who were only a small group. They were militarily overwhelmed, but they were militarily superior in strategy. So, there is a sense of inferiority which Indians had. So they said, there are certain things which the English cannot touch us in, and that is the inner life, the domestic life, where women, for example, look after the kitchen, look after the home, look after hospitality. There the English cannot, make any inroads. So India slowly becomes feminized as the inner space, the inner courtyard, and it becomes also symbolic of a certain kind of metaphysical, spiritual way of looking at things. We have the monopoly on spirituality. In fact, Swami Vivekananda once said that I want to go to the West, America. You remember 1893, he went for the great World Parliament of Religions in Chicago. And he went there and he once said that I am going to the West because my land is poor. You can't talk to starving people about God. So I want to exchange India's wisdom for American dollars. And Gandhi, in a quip, said, I think Swami Vivekananda, for a brief while, lost his Viveka. Right? How could you make this kind of a barter? But anyway, the idea that India is the repository of religion, of spirituality, is a very strong one. And I think there is some truth in it, because every major religion has had some kind of a local habitation and a name in this country. Earliest Christians came to India with St. Thomas. The Muslims constitute 12% of the population of this country. That's much larger than any Islamic nation anywhere in the world except Indonesia. Then Jainism began here, Buddhism began here, Zoroastrianism has flourished, the Parsis have flourished, and Hinduism, of course, in its variety of forms. So there's no doubt that there is a spiritual richness about this land. And this is, of course, reflected in the poetry as well. If you look at Gokak, V.K. Gokak's well-known book, and you must make a note of this. Can you tell me the title of Gokak's well-known anthology? You remember that? It's called The Golden Treasury of Indo-Anglian Poetry. Okay? Indo-Anglian verse. Gokak. And in Gokak's anthology, we have literally 50, 60, 70 poets. Many of them who have probably written only one or two poems. But he has, delved, archival research has been done by him, and he has been able to bring out the poetry of so many people. And if you look at the poetry of the late 19th century, early 20th century, which is represented, you'll find it's an overwhelmingly, spiritual kind of poetry. So Swami Vivekananda and Aurobindo are only two people, but there are many other poets whose names I can't even remember now because nobody reads them. But Gokak has put them together to demonstrate what we might call the metaphysical, spiritual, religious dimensions of India. Now, the point I'm making is important because while Vivekananda and Sri Aurobindo wrote poetry, which was very, very deeply felt, as English poetry, perhaps Swami Vivekananda's poetry doesn't have the same impact which you will expect good poetry to have on you. It's one thing to have bhakti and devotion, another to be able to write poetry on the basis of that. All right, but P. Lal was the one who attacked Sri Aurobindo. He said Sri Aurobindo is writing a poetry which nobody can understand. Second, he writes about some gluey, syrupy, metaphysical stuff which we cannot touch. We need to have hard, dry, concrete stuff. We should be able to look at things, which are actually happening around us, the reality of life. And poetry should not be flabby. It should not be loose. It should not be, incoherent. It should be hard, dry, imagistic, concrete, and something which we can appreciate for the craft and the beauty of it. In Sri Aurobindo's verse, you don't have any of this according to Lal. So we must now go against the Aurobindonian strain and write a poetry which is hard, dry, and so on. Basically, I think Lal's point was well taken. At the same time, as Professor Nadkarni, who is an Aurobindonian scholar, said that if Aurobindo is being attacked for his flabbiness and his metaphysical expansiveness and so on, I don't know what these people are like. They seem to be the lean and hungry looking Pilal. Right? The poetry is lean and hungry. Poetry must be expansive and vast. So you have two schools of thought. And in Indian English poetry, you have the Aurobindonian strain, and it's an irony that Lal, writing today, writes like Aurobindo, whom he attacked in 1950s, in the 1960s. That is all part of the politics, I think, of poetry. What Lal did in this credo was to create conditions for what we might call the modernist movement in Indian English poetry. And the three great modernists in my mind, in my view, are Ezekiel, Nissim Ezekiel, who passed away a few years ago after suffering from Alzheimer's disease for a long, long time. It was very pathetic seeing him in his old age. He couldn't remember anybody. He could not recognize people. And he was such an alert poet. You wrote anything, he would look at it so beautifully and comment on it. And he was responsible for launching so many poets in Bombay in their careers. Many of them have spoken so feelingly about Nissim Ezekiel. But towards the end, Nissim Ezekiel could hardly, talk. He couldn't recognize people. So Nissim Ezekiel, then Ramanujan, A.K. Ramanujan, and R. Parthasarathi. These are the three major poets of India who emerged in the 1950s, wrote their first volumes of poetry in the late 1950s, and all of them, in a way, were going back to our Lal's dictum that poetry should be hard, dry, concrete, and something which is beautifully crafted, beautifully written, and every word should be economically put there and so on. I'll read out a poem by Nissim Ezekiel. It's called My Cat. Okay? And this is how the poem goes. Incidentally, I am reading from an anthology which some of you might like to possess. It's called 12 Modern Indian Poets, edited by an extremely brilliant poet called Arvind Krishna Mehrotra. Now he has been tipped for the Oxford Professorship of Poetry, and very soon we will know the result of the voting. And if he makes it, it will be the first time that an Indian writer is going to be Oxford Professor of Poetry, a position which was held by none other than Matthew Arnold in the 19th century. It's a wonderful thing. But he has written this beautiful anthology, lovely introduction, and he's represented about 12 poets. But he doesn't represent Parthasarathi, whom I mentioned as one of the important poets. But here is Nissim Ezekiel's My Cat. This is how it goes. I'll read it out very slowly. My cat, unlike Verlaine's or Baudelaire's, Verlaine and Baudelaire are French poets. My cat, unlike Verlaine's or Baudelaire's, is neither diabolic nor a sphinx. Is neither diabolic nor a sphinx. Though equally at home on laps or chairs, she will not be caressed nor plays the minx. She will not be caressed nor plays the minx. She has a single mood. She is merely bored, yawns and walks away, retires to sleep, has never sniffed at where the fish is stored, nor known to relish milk, less cat than sheep. She does not condescend to chase a rat, or play with balls of wool, or show her claws to teasing guests, but in my basement flat defies all animal and human laws of love and hate. One night I will drown this cat. You see the poem? It is so beautifully organized. There is a syntactical brilliance about it. Every line moving on to the next line in a kind of a logical sequence, an associative sequence. Every word carefully used. There is a rhyme scheme. There is a certain kind of a rhythm. There is a speaking voice. And there is a kind of a meditation on what a cat should be like. And then the hit, the scorpion's tail kind of thing, the last bit. I think one of these days I will drown this cat. Because it's not doing what a cat should be doing, right? She does not condescend to chase a rat, or play with balls of wool, or show her claws to teasing guests, but in my basement flat defies all animal and human laws of love and hate. One night I'll drown this cat. I think it's beautiful, isn't it? So immediate, so powerful in its capacity to convey an experience. Because poetry is experience. This is modernism. I'll read another poem for you. This is by Ramanujan, because the other important modern poet, and this is called On the Death of a Poem. Look at the title. A poet writing on the death of a poem, right? And here it is. Images consult one another. Images consult one another. A conscience-stricken jury. A conscience-stricken jury, and come slowly to a sentence. Isn't it lovely? Because a poem is supposed to be a sentence. And the poem itself is one sentence, by the way. You can see that the whole thing is one sentence. Images consult one another, a conscience-stricken jury, and come slowly to a sentence. But sentence means two things. One, a grammatical unit. Two, sentencing someone to death. So the poem's sentence, it's a death of a poem. So through punning, through irony, through beautiful collocation of expressions, through juxtaposition, and through very severe control over the syntax and over diction, modern poetry produces a pleasurable sensation. When we read poetry like this, we begin to smile a little, sometimes we laugh outright, and we derive pleasure from the way the poem has been written. All of us, I think, want to live in a different plane, at least in our daily lives, and occasionally move towards the metaphysical and the transcendent. We can't live in the transcendental world all the time. You need to come back to the laws of gravity, isn't it? Here is another poem, and this time I'm going to take up a very contemporary poet. I've taken Nissim Ezekiel and Ramanujan because they are the great modernists. And after they wrote their poems, we had a huge number of writers between the 60s and the 80s. I would like to say a word or two about R. Parthasarathi, whose poems are not available in this particular anthology. But Parthasarathi has a book called Rough Passage. It's all about his long contact with the West. And he says that the English language has held me in thrall. I am a slave to the English language. He comes back to India and he attempts to write in Tamil, it's his mother tongue, and he feels that he cannot write in Tamil either, because Tamil culture, which was so beautiful at one time, has also degenerated into a very, very mundane kind of culture in the modern context. So he feels that he's caught between two worlds. My tongue is in English chains, he says, but now I am in India, I'm unable to write in Tamil. Therefore, probably I have to go back to writing in English. And he's written this rough passage over a period of time. And it's a poem which I think is a kind of a symbolic poem about how poetry should be written and what happens when poetry has to contend with a foreign language. I will say, quickly read for you Vikram Seth's poem because he is more contemporary. And this is a poem which is called Evening Wheat. You know, when you go to the villages, you have the wheat being harvested, put on carts, and then the farmer takes it home and so on. Evening is the best time for wheat. Toads croak, because evening, toads croak. Children ride buffaloes home for supper. Lovely village atmosphere. The last loads are shoulder borne. Squares light up, and the wheat sags with the late gold. There on the other side of the raised path is the untransplanted emerald rice. But it is the wheat I watch, not the rice. I watch the wheat, the still dark gold, with maybe a pig that has strayed from the brigade, enjoying a few soft years. Visual impact of a village, of an evening in a village, of people coming home with the harvest, and what happens when children are running around or a pig is coming and eating a bit of the wheat. Now, Seth is a good example of what I would like to end my talk with, of what we might call a diasporic poet. He doesn't live in India all the time. And many of the Indian poets in English don't live in India. Many of them live abroad. In fact, many of the novelists also live abroad. There are very few Indian novelists who live in India. So the diasporic consciousness is something which you need to keep in mind. And the idea of the nation, home and abroad, is an important theme in Indian English poetry. Modern or contemporary Indian English poetry is full of these tensions. And again, as in the fiction, there is now a tendency amongst poets not to feel guilty about writing in English, because English is an international language, it's a global language, and since you are diasporic and you don't live in India, you need to know English. You may make your home in any other part of the world. Abroad is home, and home is abroad, and therefore English becomes a unifying factor.
Actually, we can find the concept like magic realism in Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children, like Marquez. Then my question is, what is the necessity of just using that magic realism there in the novel? So why they do not just try to explicate the realism like the Victorian novels?
Yes, it's a very good question. Very good question. The point is that in India at least, this holds good in the sense there's no particular reason why people should be adopting indirect methods to express a reality. Yes. Because we are not really a topsy-turvy culture yet. We may become one in the coming years. Much of the angst of Europe and South America and America comes from historical events which have overtaken them, where they find that reality cannot be spoken of in direct ways. And therefore, many of them resort to the blurring of time and space distinctions, which is what happens in magic realism, where you won't know at what point you are actually located, and the narrative moves you from one location to the other, one time frame to the other. It happens in Looking Through Glass by Mukul Keshavan. It happens in Midnight's Children. But I think the point is that Rushdie, who has lived outside the country for so long, he's a diasporic writer, probably feels that he cannot express India directly because of his distance from it. And therefore, the only way in which he can try and articulate his sense of the disintegration of a culture, of the Nehruvian and Gandhian dream having gone awry, is through a kind of a magic realism. Thank you very much.